much more credible does it have to get?
I don't think you're getting more precise.
Coming up on 60 Minutes.
Just seems to really tear at the fabric of reality. The whole jet line would just disappear.
New hope after a decade of despair.
Even if you give me another 10 years.
In the search for MH370.
We're the right place. If we knew that, we would have searched there.
That's next on 60 Minutes.
That's next on 60 Minutes.
War with China. It sounds unthinkable, but according to many experts, the countdown may be on. China's President Xi Jinping is shaping up to the West like never before. And just last week, a major new military alliance was announced between the US, Australia and the UK to counter Chinese aggression in the Pacific.
The first major initiative of AUKUS will be to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet to Australia.
America and its allies are preparing for a battle we didn't think was possible.
The idea that China would never attack, even never invade, well, I wouldn't count on that.
Xi Jinping is already on a collision course with his own people. From recently outlawing boy bands to enforcing propaganda lessons in primary schools. Xi Jinping is taking control, and he's prepared to fight for it even beyond his homeland. If this unimaginable conflict were to happen, it would begin with an invasion of Taiwan, a tiny nation off its coast that China has long believed is theirs.
Once they make the decision to do this, they will come full bore, like a crazy man with an axe.
Control of Taiwan would give China a huge new military reach over the Pacific.
That would put Australia in the firing line pretty quickly.
But is Australia putting itself in the firing line by talking too tough to China?
It is very dangerous to frame China as worse than Darth Vader.
Tonight, we investigate just how close to war we really are.
The question of whether or not to go to war may well end up getting decided for us.
So is resistance futile?
We should not borrow a phrase from Game of Thrones, bend the knee to Beijing.
Good evening, I'm Liz Hayes, and this is Under Investigation.
This is under investigation.
Joining me tonight, 5 experts who each bring a lifetime's experience to their views on war with China.
We've got to ask ourselves the question, do you want your children or their children to live in an authoritarian world where democracy is on the ash heap of history and states no longer have freedom of speech, freedom of thought? Or is democracy worth defending?
China has been preparing for war for at least decades. Its whole military organization has largely been aimed towards having a war over Taiwan.
I think that war with China should be unthinkable and should remain unthinkable, because when we talk about war with China, we're talking about the potential for a level of casualties and destruction that this country has certainly never experienced and would be devastating for people across Asia.
I do think it is very dangerous to frame China as completely evil, only malevolent. Yes, there is a bad China, where China does things that we find unacceptable. But I think it's really important for Australia to accept that there is also a good China. There are things that China does and can do that are for the benefit of the world.
Clinton Fernandez, you would argue that it's time for ordinary Australians to be aware of this.
Absolutely. I think it's very important that this debate occur. I'm glad it's occurring here. War is an extremely serious matter. It will shape the destiny of the world for the next 75 years.
been engaged in a war of words with China on human rights and more recently the origins of COVID-19.
It remains Australia's firm view that understanding the cause of this pandemic has nothing to do with politics. It's essential for preventing the next one.
And China has bitten back, hitting us with punishing trade sanctions. Tensions and rhetoric are escalating. Earlier this year, a senior Australian security official warned of the beating drums of war coming from China, echoed by Defence Minister Peter Dutton.
I don't think it's actually discounted. I think China has been very clear about that goal.
So are we unnecessarily antagonising a superpower and major trading partner? Are we talking ourselves into a war? Or are we bravely standing up to an aggressive China?
Australia has shown the world how one deals with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party in particular.
Colonel Brad Newsham is a China specialist and former head of intelligence for the US Marine Forces in the Pacific.
Biggest complaint about the Australians is that there's not 10 times as many of them. They were the first ones to stand up and say, no, we're not going to put up with this. Australia's future is going to have to fight for it if you want to keep it. And the idea that China would never attack, even never invade, well, I wouldn't count on that.
But Australia is making a very expensive enemy. Our war of words with China is already costing us billions in exports every year. And at a time when Australia is ramping up its defence budget to be better prepared for any conflict with China.
I just think it's tremendously ironic that we choose to lead the world in being tough on China, where we're so economically vulnerable. The military upgrades that we're talking about, the extra spending on our defence forces, we can afford this stuff because of our really profitable trade with China.
Is that true, Mum?
The decision to spend money on defence is
Kung ako gamay,
based
bili na
on
yung
threat perception, and threat perception is focused exclusively on a rising China. We no longer have 10 years strategic warning time for a major attack on this country. The ball's in their court. They need to actually realise that they are responsible for not us.
Historian Dr. David Murphy believes the smartest strategy will be to engage with China because he thinks a war-weary America may not have the stomach for more conflict, even if it is in our
unthinkable for a lot of people in Canberra, particularly in the defence sector, that Australia could do that alone without America in the neighbourhood in a position to help out Australia get itself. But there is no military threat from China to Australia. I mean, I want to state that very clearly.
Look at China's stated goals. They claim all of this outcome. If China achieves that, the way the region operates changes fundamentally. China spends more on its military than the whole of Asia combined.
He's absolutely right. It's about Chinese domination of the Indo-Pacific region. And I don't think any Australian citizen would willingly embrace that sort of relationship with China. We should not, to borrow a phrase from Game of Thrones, bend the knee to Beijing.
But experts warn if words ever turn to war, Australians will pay a terrible price.
We're dealing with the potential for a conflict that could be much more impactful on ordinary Australians than anything we've seen in recent decades.
A former Australian soldier
practice.
David Kilcullen now leads
Sabi sa man ang i-question God.
Operations Research Group, which looks at how coming wars are likely to play out. He fears Australia is already China's punching bag. Xi Jinping's way of sending his message to the US.
We are seeing not only an escalation of US and Chinese rhetoric against each other, but Australia increasingly being seen as a US ally that the Chinese feel they can push around to try to send a message to others.
John, are we seeing China bullying Australia into thinking, at least, that there's trouble coming?
The grand narrative of the Chinese Communist Party certainly is that one, China is undeterrable. Two, its goals are fixed. and 3, will pay any cost to achieve those goals. Effectively to say, stay out of it because it is hopeless to put up any resistance, and you might as well stay on the sidelines and deal with China as China wants to be dealt with.
I do think it is very dangerous to frame China as completely evil, only malevolent. Trying to frame China as like worse than Darth Vader.
Yes, I agree with all of that, but at what point do you decide you can't just keep stepping
Nothing
back?
No, we shouldn't step back.
So is resistance futile?
No, it's not futile.
I just think this talk of war amongst the general Australian public makes people fearful, it makes people anxious, and unfortunately I think it makes the prospect of more war more likely.
I think we can show as much nuance as possible and be as accommodating as possible and not mention the war word once, and they will still occupy the South China Sea, and they will still coerce their neighbours. It is China, after all, that rolls nuclear ballistic missiles through Tiananmen Square on National Day parades and tanks and displays their military might. And in speeches threatens the defence of Westerners against a Great Wall of Steel.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully us. Anyone who dares to try will have their heads bashed bloody against the Great Wall of Steel.
This is incredibly nationalist war talk that the Chinese are using.
But this war of words is increasingly turning into confrontation. If there be a war with China, everyone agrees that the trigger will be Taiwan. The tiny island nation sitting off its coast that President Xi Jinping has already stated he wants incorporated into communist China.
Xi Jinping cannot afford politically to walk back from his commitment to take Taiwan. That would be the end of his power base, the end of his control.
The Chinese Communist Party claims Taiwan is historically part of China, which, strictly speaking, isn't true. The island has an indigenous population dating back thousands of years. A flourishing democracy, Taiwan would be an immense strategic and economic prize.
Last year, our radar stations have detected incursions by nearly 2,000 Chinese military aircraft and over 400 military vessels.
Not only would it give China a military footprint well into the Pacific Ocean, it would also give China fabulous wealth. Taiwan has the 6th largest foreign exchange reserve in the world. And the island state supplies the bulk of the world's semiconductor computer chips, critical to most modern manufacturing products, from washing machines to cutting-edge weaponry. And it's sitting there, out of China's clutches, with America's backing. Why does China need Taiwan so badly?
Taiwan is the veritable unsinkable aircraft carrier from which China can project military power deep out into the Central Pacific. Taiwan demonstrates to the world that you can have prosperity and democracy.
Taiwan is definitely a prize. I mean, firstly, it's a challenge, an ideological challenge to the one-party state system of China. But there's also a deeply emotional sense that is motivating China's leadership.
Since it was created in 1949 after the Chinese Civil War, Taiwan has never officially declared its independence from China. Doing so, according to our experts, would be an instant trigger for war. If Taiwan does say it wants to be independent, what happens?
China will invade.
Simple as that.
Yep.
Those who warn of China's intentions for Taiwan point to the example of Hong Kong, which is now as good as taken over by the Chinese Communist Party
katong
after
sila ng
crushing
2019 na
pro-democracy
kuan,
demonstrations there.
riot sa Hong Kong.
And there is no one who
Nagpamuli
wants
na
to
ako ba?
protect Taiwan's independence more than its former Vice President, Madame Annette Lu, who spent years in jail fighting to establish the island's democracy.
So I think it's very immoral if anyone has the interest in launching any kind of war at this critical moment of the earth.
Madame Lu proposes establishing what she calls a democratic commonwealth, comprising Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan to balance China's power.
We can make a golden triangle in the region, and we also welcome Australia from the south, America, Canada from the other side of the Pacific. We all the peace-loving democracies.
Malcolm Davis believes Australia should stand up for a fellow democracy in our region, particularly if China should decide to invade Taiwan.
If we do not act in the face of a Chinese aggressive move against Taiwan, then morally and ethically, we have fallen off our pedestal. We have done the wrong thing. I think that we do need to think about the implications of the lives of 24 million Taiwanese. One only has to look at Xinjiang province, where there's over 1 million Uyghurs behind essentially barbed wire, just for being Uyghurs. Situation playing out in Taiwan where millions of Taiwanese are in essentially concentration camps.
I think as the world has seen from forays into Afghanistan, invasion is one thing. Keeping control, managing a restive Taiwan population who have experienced democracy and feel passionately about democracy is going to be quite another.
Whether it wants to go to war for Taiwan or not, China is certainly ready for it, and ready to take on the US and anyone else who steps into the fight.
I've been watching China and the Chinese military coming up on 40 years now. But what you've seen really in the last 20 years is probably the world's biggest, fastest military buildup ever. Not just since World War II, but perhaps in human history.
According to Colonel Grant Newsham, the former head of intelligence for the US Marine Forces in the Pacific, the scale of China's military buildup focused on Taiwan is unparalleled and alarming.
So, in your opinion, what are they doing? Are they preparing for a fight, or is this a deterrent?
Well, you first have to ask, who would it deter? Have you ever heard anybody say that they wanted to attack China? It's really for an offensive purpose. And the first thing they want to do is to get the Americans out of Asia, and the ultimate objective is global domination.
Here, I really disagree. I really disagree with this idea of global domination. Nobody matches the United States when it comes to aircraft carriers and power projection. What China has got the ability to do with this buildup is to take Taiwan and prevent the United States from interfering with it when it does so. That's not global domination at all.
Taiwan has always counted on US support, but after a humiliating exit from Afghanistan, America may have lost its taste for war. In the event of China invading Taiwan, the big question that will determine the future of the region, and probably the world, is will the US come to Taiwan's defense? Professor David Brophy believes that's no longer entirely certain.
We have tended to assume in this discussion that if there was a Chinese move that the United States would be there. But people in Taiwan are asking themselves the question, is that actually the case? Would America be willing to risk a confrontation with China that could escalate into attacks on America, on the Chinese mainland, for the sake of Taiwan?
If America does not do anything, it would be the beginning of the end of the US-led alliance system. And if you spend any time in Washington at all, you will realize that that is not acceptable to the Americans. If you look at the last 100 years of history, America does sacrifice blood and treasure in a big way to achieve the strategic aims. So I would say almost with certainty the US will come to Taiwan's defense.
John Lee is right. If the US doesn't react, then it loses all strategic credibility in the region, and the broader risk of the US losing strategic credibility in the region would be horrendous. For Australia, we would be on our own.
Awesome.
As well as increasingly
Mga alas
aggressive
11,
international
dami-dami.
moves, like expanding China's huge navy into the Pacific. President Xi Jinping has been cracking down hard on his own people to bring them into line with Communist Party thinking. Xi calls it rectification, and he's banned everything from boy bands and reality TV shows to foreign computer games and apps. China's private schools have been all but decimated by new regulations, and lessons on what's called Xi Jinping thought are now compulsory in primary schools. It's as if it's a population being readied for trouble. So if it came to war, how would it actually play out?
Grabe kay, muna man sa China ma, muna sa communist. Communist ba? Grabe kay ano, ang CCTV nila dito na nanaykuan ba? Detalye nimo. Kita na ka CCTV, mabasa ka.
Has war gained an invasion of Taiwan and says China would use a tactic learned from the US military operation Desert
Maski pag ganang, kuan, dili ka gusto, masunod diya, mong sundon yun. Oh, sundon ka, tago na lang. Muna communist.
From Chinese writings that they've studied Desert Storm, the Chinese have thousands of ballistic missiles that are arrayed along the Chinese east coast, and those rockets and those ballistic missiles would be targeting Taiwan's key nodes, military centers, their ports, their airfields, known garrison locations of Taiwan army forces. I think there's no question in my mind that China, once they make a decision, they become full war, like a crazy man with an axe.
The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. In the first Gulf War, the United States bombed Iraq for 42 days and 42 nights consecutively in order to achieve its objectives. There is nothing that's stopping China from doing that, and there is very little the United States can do to affect it, except at very, very great cost. Both sides know how this is going to play out. The only question is, who's got the most will?
Malcolm, in terms of firepower, though, China has some very impressive weaponry.
Yeah, they're developing this very long-range strike capability that is designed to be able to strike at the US and its allies. One of the systems they're developing is the DF-26, which is an intermediate-range ballistic missile that can strike at US carriers as far out as Guam. If they can sink aircraft carriers, that's a huge loss of life. Each aircraft carrier has about 5,000 personnel on board. So the potential for the Chinese to impose huge costs on the US and its allies, including Australia, is very real.
China's President Xi Jinping ensures his country's military might is there for his people and the world to see. And adding to his war footing, off the coast in disputed territory, China has built artificial islands
loaded with defensive hardware. Since 2013, China has built 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea, Taiwan area, 1,300.
Dr. David Brophy argues China is simply defending its coastline, just as we do in Australia.
We need to remember this is all playing out along China's coastline. To talk about deterring China, what that is effectively saying is that we want to maintain a favourable military balance right up to your doorstep, that we'll be able to dominate in a situation of conflict anything that takes place right off your coast. Now, just imagine if a country on the other side of the world said that to Australia, that we want to prevent you from being able to control militarily the territory off your coast. I think we in Australia would regard that as a hostile posture.
And Dr. Brophy cautions an all-out war between the world's superpowers could well involve nuclear weapons.
I don't think there's any way we can confidently say that this can be contained to a small war, which I think some people imagine that it can be, that there's some sort of little stoush that we could have in the Taiwan Strait. I think that that's one possible scenario, but another is all-out nuclear barbarism. And America maintains the option of first-use nuclear strike, which suggests to me that it wants to position itself in such a way to say to China, we are willing to fight.
We are willing to fight.
We are willing to hold nuclear weapons at you.
When it comes to something this important, this potentially devastating to the globe, you don't take anything off the table.
Indeed, Jim Fennell believes the US needs to maintain its credible threat of using tactical nuclear weapons in a first strike.
I want Xi Jinping and the next person and the next person to always wonder, hey, is there a nuclear missile coming down on my head right now? I want them to think that. That doesn't mean I want to do it, but I want to be able to rationally let them know we have that capability, and if we get pressed too much, you think you're the angry guy with the axe? You have not seen anything yet.
Is this when you come out to say that's just plain nuts?
I just find this whole discussion completely depressing. I think everybody around this table would agree we don't want war. Because if it is a war between these superpowers, nobody knows where the nuclear threshold is going to be. Nobody knows what is that point when one side or the other will start to use nuclear weapons. It is that serious that I think we should all be focused here in Australia about de-escalating things and how do we do everything that we can to prevent armed conflict and to make sure that the United States and China can find some way to live with each other.
But Dr. Brophy believes that as China sees us as America's closest ally, there's even a possibility that Australia may become a nuclear target.
I hate to speculate about the situation because it's so horrible to think about, but if China and America do enter into a conflict situation, China wants to take a step up the escalatory ladder without necessarily striking the US mainland. Then a country like Australia becomes an option. As a way of, sending a message that they're serious, but without taking the risk of hitting America directly because of the potential for that to produce massive nuclear retaliation.
No, I mean, I think to be clear to the Chinese, that the Chinese strike Australian territory with WMDs. That is treated as an attack on the US. The US will retaliate with
Frighteningly, Australia's forward planners, including Professor Calhoun,
believes the future operations research group also don't rule out a nuclear strike from
If
China.
it does go
kinetic, as we call it,
between the US and China,
but also in between the US and China, it reaches that tactical nuclear threshold. I think it is really quite likely that Australia
Now,
really
I think strategists on both sides don't want this to go nuclear, but if it does,
nuclear, but
that
if
would
it
put
does,
Australia
then
in fire.
that would put Australia in the firing
The
line
Chinese know
pretty
that if they
quickly.
use nuclear
The
weapons,
Chinese
we'll
know
use
that
nuclear
if we
weapons
use
back, and
nuclear
that will be the end of the
weapons,
PRC. Okay, so they understand the implications of crossing the nuclear threshold.
Our strong relationship with America, including Australia's ANZUS treaty, has meant we've stood shoulder to shoulder with the US in every major conflict of the last century, including the most unpopular, expensive and punishing like Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan. Our experts believe that a war with China, if triggered by an invasion of Taiwan, will involve Australia. That's because whatever America does, we will follow.
I think that Australia is acting in such a way as to signal its willingness to go along with a tougher American strategy. That is the strategy for Australia.
war between China and the US will essentially be happening in our backyard, is this a conflict Australia will be able to avoid, even if we wanted to? Our close military ties to the US include American intelligence bases on our soil, Pine Gap in the Northern Territory and Northwest Cape on the coast of Western Australia.
Into action, and that would unfortunately entail that Australian soil may well be used in a conflict before Australians have actually had a say in that question.
The truth is, the Australian government has little control over what occurs at these bases or what defence decisions might come from them when the US faces war.
The Pine Gap base is a joint Australian and United States facility.
Because of the US assets on Australian soil, it's true, isn't it, that an order to fire can be made and we won't know about it.
Absolutely. We call these things the joint facilities, but the fact is, members of American Congress have more oversight and knowledge as to what goes on in these facilities than members of the Australian Parliament. We have to recognise the position that we're in. The most important question in any society can face, the question of whether or not to go to war, may well end up getting decided for us.
Whatever the scenario for war, our future planners agree it would be a front line like no other in history, where Australia might be crippled before a single shot is fired.
Almost certainly one of the first things that would happen in a major conflict between the US and China would be knocking out of the GPS system to disable a lot of US military systems that rely on that. The moment that happens, you can't run an FPOS transaction in Australia. You can't fuel up your car at the petrol station because all of that depends on GPS. Australia's economy would be very heavily impacted in the first few minutes. In a matter of weeks, we struggle to get enough fuel and oil. So it's really tempting to think that we could just sit this one out and ignore it, but the reality is we can't. So this is one of these situations where you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, and there's just no way for us to avoid that.
But we have an ANZUS treaty.
Well, that raises a whole host of questions. The ANZUS treaty is actually, I think its importance is inflated. The only requirement that ANZUS imposes on Australia or the US is that there is consultation in the case of conflict. Why I think we should stay out is that this would not be a war for Taiwan or a war for democracy. This would be an escalation of the US-China rivalry, which to my mind is essentially about economic interests, political dominance in regions of the world. I don't ultimately see moral high ground.
I'm sorry, I can't agree with David's take on this. The US-Australia alliance is critical to our national security. Looking at the scenario where we choose not to go in other words, David's preferred option, we then have to think about the strategic consequences of doing that. ANZUS falls apart, okay? So we are on our own in every sense of the word.
An alliance is always a living agreement. The reality is that if we are not in a conflict with Taiwan, where Japan, which is committed recently to entering, if Japan and the United States are in there, and we stay out of the way, it is the end of the ANZUS alliance for any practical purposes.
But will ordinary Australians even get a say in whether we join the US in a war with China? Clinton, is it correct that Australia's involvement in any conflict doesn't necessarily need a vote in Parliament, does it?
That's correct. The decision to deploy troops is just a decision by the Prime Minister, who tells the Defence Minister, and that's it.
And so therefore the Australian people don't really get to debate this, do they?
The only debate that's occurring is what's occurring here, thanks to you.
Yeah, because my whole point is that all of what we're discussing is pretty chilling on a lot of levels for the average Australian.
Yes, the last time the Australian Defence Force was involved in a high-intensity conflict was in Korea. We were 20 years in Afghanistan and the Taliban didn't even have an air force.
Also of critical concern to our experts is the impact a war with China would have on nearly 1.5 million Chinese Australians. After all, during World War II, Japanese Australians, despite having lived here for more than 50 years, were rounded up and imprisoned.
All those sociological consequences have not been factored in. With people of ethnic Chinese descent or people who look like people of ethnic Chinese descent being abused in the streets, calls from the extreme right and the fringes for them to be placed in internment camps.
Do you fear, all of you, that Chinese Australians will be seen as the enemy within?
Absolutely. I mean, the Australian Chinese community and everybody who look vaguely sort of Chinese, in the event that, you know, there is a war with China, what Clinton said, this notion of internment camps, you know, is a very real prospect. You know, John, I'll see you there.
There's no cosmopolitan, anti-racist way to gear a country's foreign and military policy towards confronting China without that stoking anti-Chinese racism. That is the reality that we're facing.
The major wars of the last 20 years have produced no wins. The US struggles on in Iraq, and along with Australia, it has pulled the pin on Afghanistan. The big question is, in a global showdown between China and America, who would win?
Who would win?
There's really no nice way to put it, but the Chinese have not overtaken us. They've put us in a position where they can probably defeat us in certain circumstances. Depends on how the fight takes place.
Former US Marine Intelligence Chief is far from sure that America will prevail in any showdown with China, especially with support in waters around Taiwan.
They have now got a navy that is bigger than ours. And just to give you one sense of things, the South China Sea, which is the hot spot, those contested mountains, the Chinese could probably put 10 ships into the water for every one that the Americans can send in.
Have we underestimated the drop-in?
Yes, we have underestimated the Chinese consistently over the last few decades. We no longer do that. And certainly in the war in Taiwan Strait, China could emerge victorious in a military sense. China has been preparing for war in Taiwan.
Well, I don't want to find out the answer to this question. The scenario for post-war on Taiwan is not just bad for China, it's bad for the world. I mean, we're talking about a situation that could trigger, you know, environmental crises, economic crises. I think that, you know, we're being very light-minded just to imagine that the world will be sort of roughly the same as it was, just with China in control of Taiwan.
Do we take it for granted that America will win any kind of war, or do you accept that we may not?
The bottom line is America may not win, but they actually have to prepare the best to try and hold the line here because it's so crucial. If you just give up, throw up our hands and basically say, well, Taiwan, you're on your own, then we're giving China that century that it wants.
In conclusion, those warning a war tonight say we have two critical questions to consider. Should we be prepared to allow China to simply take Taiwan, as it has declared it will do, and may do very soon? And if so, are we happy to live with the potential consequences of doing nothing? Or is there one more fundamental consideration? Are we really ready to face the prospect of global war? Or, as we've also discussed tonight, are we more in danger of talking ourselves into one?
What I have issue with is this notion that China wants to dominate the world. China wants to protect its interests, absolutely. But this notion that China is a dark force that wants to take over the world and subjugate everybody, I don't think there's any credible evidence for that. And it's good that we've had this debate, but we have to make sure that we conduct a debate in a way that doesn't cause and anxiety amongst the
Mayroon tayo.
Australian, because if we do that,
Nara sa kuan.
it puts us on a path
Kilid yan.
which leads
Baga nara doon sa Hong Kong ba?
to all of the whole
Kaya nang kuan.
we've been discussing today.
Guangzhou.
If China takes Taiwan,
Wala gid ka
or
sentro.
do nothing,
Well, I think if things heat up, I think that we do need to say that. I think we need to call on all parties to stop and frame it. I think for the future of humanity, we need to get away from this notion that it's just a dog-eat-dog world and the only way to resolve disputes is through military force. I think we see that on the Chinese side, but I think we also see that in some of the opinions that are being put forward this evening.
If China takes Taiwan, it doesn't stop. It's the first step in that expansion. China has told us that the only thing stopping China from invading Taiwan is consequences. So if the United States or Australia said we will not be involved, that massively increases the chances that China will decline to use force to so-called resolve this push.
If you have the US going into harm's way to defend Taiwan, which after all, remember, is a fellow Western democracy just like Australia, we would be negligent in our responsibilities as a US ally if we stood back and did nothing. I do think that it is incumbent upon our government of the
When they try to show culture, the point balance is whether something will prejudice or it has positive value. Essentially, let me weigh whether the damaging impact of this particular issue outweighs whether it helps. And the point is that you always defer to the defendant. You always defer to something that is remediable so that you err on the side of helping the defendant, so that you err on the side of protecting political speech or whatever constitutional right at that moment. So here, it really boggles my mind that they wouldn't err on the side of protecting a political candidate, a presidential political candidate's life, especially because the trial ended. So, look, I'm not the president's attorney, but I would say yes for away, Mr. President, and just deal with the consequences after. Because the consequences for him speaking as he should have on stage during the debate will have far greater consequences for him than acquiescing to this particular scandal.
Kennedy that everyone's talking about are for the American people. I mean, if they can't hear from the presidential candidate, then how do they vote? I mean, that's the height of election interference. It has been benefiting the former president so far. So, you know, if I were him, I would actually secretly want them to keep the guy or the guy were in play on it. Of course, he should fight back. He looks like he's fighting back, particularly if I don't know, then you got the truth. But I can't, my lips are sealed by this entire establishment that is training against me and just wants to block me and you with your useless prosperity.
Ikaw ka? Ano? Ikaw? Ano? Di, ka panitag ko di ano ko. Kasi na ba itong bitrot? Tuntun na nila. Bitrot, dragon fruit. Ano, di niya. Sumugod ka na asawa mo. Pinaayos mo ng kapalit lagi.
Video na ginawa ng mga hamas ng Chinese Coast Guard sa resupply mission ng Pilipinas noong June 17, inilabas ng Armed Forces of the Philippines.
Vice President Sara Duterte magiging tunay na leader ng oposisyon. Ayon kay dating presidential spokesperson Atty. Roque Unitin, lusaw na ayon sa dating opisyal.
Umano'y pagiging bagong leader ng oposisyon ni Vicky Duterte, sinosya ng Liberal Party.
PBBM administration na namong tutunan ang kapulaman ng
Maging seleksyon sa mga warehouse at bahay sa pagpakla ng mga kaligtad ng Pogo, nagpapatuloy. Baguio City, nananatiling Pogo free ayon kay Mayor Benny Magalo.
Ang nationwide brownout naranasan sa bansang Ecuador.
Magandang tanghali mga kasambahan. Ito ay araw ng Webes, June 20, 2024. Ang unang mamalita ngayong tanghali. Nagdidiw si Vice President Sara Duterte sa kabinete ni Pangulong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Ngunit hindi nagpapali ang pangalawang Pangulo ang anumang dahilan kung bakit ito nagsasabi. Ang detalya sa magiging action na
Ngayon sa nagrelasyon na si Vice President Sara Duterte mula sa pagiging sa Duterte at co-vice chairperson kaya nilang siya sa 30-day notification ng dalawang Pangulo. Wala yung sinabi niya na nag-resignation sa gabinete ni Pangulong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Ngunit linahit nito na ang kanyang mga motibo ay hindi na mapapawi. Personal namang nagtungo sa Sara sa pagkakaroon ng kagawaran ng edukasyon upang i-anunsyo ang kanyang pinipinali ng Defense Secretary.
June 19, 2024, we sought an audience with the President, effected my resignation of Secretary of Education effective July 19, 2024. I am given 50-day notice to ensure the proper and orderly transition for the benefit of the next generation.
Castro. Well, hindi, kasi sinero, dahil matagal na anis sa akin Sara ang pamilito sa DepEd upang makapaglagay ng ibang mas karapat-dapat na mamuno sa ahensya. Nasayang umano ang 2 taon sa pwesto ng kanilin ng DepEd para maisaayos ang problema sa edukasyon, mag-iasal at benepisyo ng mga guro. Mawamaksan na inani ang Great Cabinet hindi na mamumuha ng NTF-ELCA na instrumento lamang sa paglaban sa kapatapag-tao at pagpapakalat ng fake news. Ngunit ayon sa National Task Force na ang Communist Card to the NTF-ELCA, inirespeto ng ahensya ang hindi sa pwesto ni Duterte. Asher Canapan Jr., UNTV News and Rescue. Diyos ang aming sandigan, serbisyo publiko ang aming pinahalagahan.
Naniniwala si dating presidential spokesperson Atty. Harry Roque na si Vice President Sara Duterte na ang susunod na magiging leader ng oposisyon kontra Marcos administration. Ito ang inihayag ng Atty. Roque kasunod ng pagpilipino sa kabinet ni VP Sara bilang kalihim ng Department of Education at Vice Chairperson ng NTF-ELCA. Isa sa aming tingin kung bakit medyo nalibigaw ang posisyon ni Marcos and then when posisyon sa Marcos samantalang ang ilan sa leader ay nakuha na bahagi pa rin ng official cabinet. Marcos, hindi na po siya bahagi ng official cabinet. Marcos, titigalan niya po siya bilang opposition leader. Hindi mo po siya
Position.
Pag-apoy. Sa gabinete ay magpapakita lamang anya na dissolve o dissolve na ang unity. Ang unity, ang campaign team nila PBBM at VP Sara sa panahon ng kampanya noong 2022.
Makikinig tinutulong ng Liberal Party o LP ang naging pakayag ni dating Presidential Spokesperson Harry Roque na si Vice President Sara Duterte na ang bagong leader ng oposisyon matapos itong mag-ibigay sa kabinete ni Pangulong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Sa isang pahayag, sinabi ni LP Spokesperson sa Senador Leyda de Lima na may mga patutunan ang pagiging sa oposisyon. Ayon de Lima, isa na rito ang pagkakaroon ng edukasyon ng accountability, transparency at pagmamalasakit sa mamamayan. Kapakanan din niya ng taong bayan ang tulong ng oposisyon. Sinabi pa ng tagapagsalita ng Partido Liberal na ang pagkalas ni VP Sara sa administrasyon ay pag-amin lamang umano na palabas lamang ang unity sa unity noong 2022 elections.
Nire-respeto ang ilang senador ang desisyon ni Vice President Duterte na magpipili sa gabinete ng Administrasyon Marcos para kay Senate President Francis G. Duterte. Inaasahan na ang pagbaba sa pwesto ni VP Sara bilang kalihim mula ng simulang atakihin ni dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte at mga kapatid ng Presidente si Pangulong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. at First Family. Mas naging hayadaan niya ito ng mahihilig si VP Sara sa mga polisiya at administrasyon ng mga issue gaya ng West Philippine Sea, ang Pilipinas Scheme, mga kaso ni Apollo, Iloy at iba pa. Suportado naman ni Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa ang desisyon ng Vice Presidente. Para sa mga mabakas na kilalang kaalyado ng mga Duterte, iwala siya para sa ikabubuti ng mga Pilipino ang kanyang naging konsiderasyon sa mga aksyon. Kanyang susuportahan ni Senator Bato si VP Sara mapalaluman ang kanyang desisyon at posisyon. Si Senator Amy Marcos nagpahayag din ng suporta kay VP Sara at sinabing mananatiling ang kanyang tiwala at pagmamahal sa Vice Presidente. Patuloy niyang sasamahan ng Presidential Sister si VP Sara sa isang hangarin na magtagumpay ang Pilipinas. Para naman kay Senate Minority Leader ng Pilipino Bongbong Pimentel, agad na dapat maghanda si Pangulong Marcos para sa ipapalit kay VP Duterte bilang kalihim ng Department of Education o DepEd. Anya, dapat nasa loob ito ng DepEd at pamilya sa problema ng sektor ng edukasyon. Senator Julian na mananatili sa kagawaran
Finish.